My routine at the factory had always been a reflection of silence and solitude. Every night, the same path, the same cameras, and the same empty corridors. I liked it. The monotony calmed me. There was something comforting in the repetition of hours, in the absence of surprises. When the lights went out and the factory was deserted, I could only hear the distant echo of the machines that had been shut down, as if the structure itself were breathing slowly, sleeping along with me. The silence was almost absolute, except for the occasional creak of a metal structure adjusting to the cold night. My job was simple: watch, monitor the cameras, and make rounds from time to time. The building was a maze of steel and concrete, corridors that seemed endless, and rooms that appeared to be forgotten by any form of life. The factory was immense, and at night, it felt like a sleeping giant, lurking in the darkness. I used to think that if there was such a thing as a heart of stone, it would beat like the factory, cold, constant, but unshakably present. I felt safe there, in my security booth, with the camera screens illuminating my face in shades of green and gray. It was a false sense of security, but it worked for me. What did I have to fear? It was just me in the walls, night after night. My biggest challenge was fighting off sleep, nothing more. Until that day. It was an ordinary day until everything changed. The news came like a whisper through the corridors. An accident. One of the worst the factory had ever seen. I don't know exactly what happened. They said it was a problem with one of the old machines, something related to an electrical failure. What I know is that, in a matter of minutes, 3 men were dead. One of them I knew well, Roberto, a quiet but friendly guy, always stopped by to chat with me during the nights when he had overtime. The other 2 I didn't know that well, just familiar faces I had seen on the cameras. A few nights after the accident, things started to get worse. I had always prided myself on being a rational person, the kind who doesn't believe in ghosts or superstitions. So, when I started seeing strange things on the security cameras, my first reaction was to try to find a logical explanation. Maybe the cameras were malfunctioning, some technical issue, or maybe it was just fatigue playing tricks on me. But what I saw, that was hard to ignore. One time, I was reviewing the footage as usual, with the sound of the fans buzzing in the background, creating a hypnotic rhythm that generally calmed me. However, as I was going through one of the cameras that monitored the hallway near the site of the accident, I noticed a quick movement. A shadow, something passing rapidly across the corner of the screen, like a blur. My first thought was that it could be a reflection. Maybe a bird or a rat sneaking through the shadows. But when I rewound the footage, what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. The shadow had no defined shape. It seemed like a dark and indistinct mass, moving with a disturbing fluidity. And the strangest part was that the shadow seemed to have intent. It wasn't just random movement. It looked like it was deliberately moving, as if it was searching for something. Or someone. I tried to ignore what I had seen, convincing myself it was just a glitch in the recording, a defect in the camera. But as the nights went on, the apparitions became more frequent. Always at the same time. Always in the same areas. And what once was just an indistinct shadow started to take shape. It was hard to describe, as if the darkness itself was solidifying, taking on a more concrete, more threatening presence. One night, while watching the live feed, I saw the shadow again, but this time, it wasn't alone. There were more figures, appearing at the edges of the screens, moving swiftly from side to side, as if they were dancing to a macabre rhythm I couldn't hear. My heart raced, and my hand froze over the keyboard, unable to react. They were there, on those screens, but when I looked down the hallway through the security window, there was nothing. It was as if they existed in a dimension that only the cameras could capture. I remember one particular night when the feeling of panic was uncontrollable. I was watching the footage from a camera positioned right at the entrance of the accident hallway. I saw the shadow form once again, stretching, elongating until it almost touched the camera lens. And then, for a brief moment, it seemed to look directly at me. I don't know how to explain it, shadows don't have eyes, but I felt that gaze. A chill ran down my spine, and I nearly jumped out of my chair, instinctively wanting to flee. But instead of running, I stayed there, hypnotized by terror, unable to look away. The shadow disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, fading into the walls as if it had never existed. And for a moment, I thought that perhaps I really was going mad. That my mind, overwhelmed by isolation and the trauma of the accident, was creating things that didn't exist. However, the frequency of these appearances, the consistency with which they showed up at the same time, in the same areas, made it impossible to deny what was happening. Something had been unleashed in that factory, something I couldn't understand. And as the nights passed, I began to realize that it wasn't me watching the cameras. It was as if those shadows were watching me, studying my movements, waiting for the right moment to act. Panic started to settle in me. The place I once knew so well now felt like a labyrinth full of invisible eyes, watching every step I took. And the more I tried to ignore it, the more the shadows appeared, taunting me, reminding me that I wasn't alone in that factory. The factory had become a trap. And I, the rat caught in its maze. That night, I was more tired than usual. My eyelids felt heavy, and the constant hum of the inactive machines was almost an invitation to sleep. I was sitting in my booth, reviewing the footage as always, when something snapped me out of my drowsiness. It was a figure. Not an indistinct shadow like before, but a clear, human shape running through the factory's corridors. My heart skipped a beat, and I straightened up in my chair, fixing my eyes on the screen. The figure moved quickly, its legs strong and determined, but without any identifiable features. It was dressed in something dark, as if trying to blend into the surrounding darkness. It seemed to be fleeing from something, or perhaps chasing after something. The camera only caught a glimpse before the figure disappeared around the corner, vanishing from my sight. My fingers trembled as I rewound the footage, trying to focus on the figure's face. But there was nothing. It was as if the figure knew exactly where the cameras were, avoiding revealing any identifiable details. My stomach churned with adrenaline, and a chill ran down my spine. I knew it wasn't someone from the factory, at least, not someone I recognized. Then I heard the knock. Loud, sudden, as if someone had slammed their fist into the metal door of my booth with all their strength. The sound reverberated through the small space, making my heart leap into my throat. For a moment, I was frozen, my eyes locked on the screen, trying to process what had just happened. The knock had been so unexpected, it felt like the air had been ripped from my lungs. I stood up with a jolt, nearly knocking over my chair in the process. Fear pulsed through my veins, but so did a morbid curiosity, a need to know who, or what, had disturbed me. I grabbed my flashlight, its beam trembling in my shaky hand. Each of my breaths echoed in the small booth as I prepared to open the door. Every part of me screamed not to do it. To stay in the relative safety of my booth, locked and isolated. But something stronger, maybe pride or the simple need to face the fear, made me turn the handle. The door creaked open, the sound seeming far too loud in that oppressive silence. The factory, shrouded in darkness, looked even more imposing, more threatening. The weak beam of my flashlight swept across the corridor in front of my booth, revealing only emptiness in the inert machines, like sleeping beasts waiting to be awakened. I took a step outside, my ears attuned to any sound, any movement that might give away the presence of that figure. The corridor was empty. The knock had been real, I knew that, but there was no one there. I walked slowly, my heart pounding, trying to ignore the feeling that something was watching me, laughing at me from the shadows. As I advanced, the factory around me seemed to come to life, the sounds of metal creaking and groaning, as if the very walls were trying to warn me. I reached the spot where the figure had disappeared on the cameras. Nothing. Just the empty, endless corridor stretching out before me. The darkness seemed to go on forever, swallowing the light from my flashlight. The air was colder here, almost freezing, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Suddenly, a low, constant noise came from the end of the corridor, like someone was whispering. I stopped, holding my breath, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The sound seemed to come from all directions, echoing through the corridor, confusing my senses. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, my mouth dry, and sweat trickling down my forehead. And then, once again, a knock, this time, farther away, weaker, but unmistakable. It came from the other end of the corridor, near the storage areas. It was clear I was being led, drawn to a place I knew I shouldn't go. But curiosity, or perhaps the madness slowly taking hold, pushed me forward. I walked toward the sound, each step echoing against the walls around me. The factory, once so familiar, now felt like a strange place, a labyrinth of shadows and sounds that I couldn't control. The further I went, the more oppressive the darkness became, as if it were closing in around me, suffocating any hope of turning back. Then, I reached the storage door. It was slightly ajar, swaying gently as if someone had just passed through. My heart was in my throat as I pushed the door open, revealing whatever awaited me on the other side. As I pushed the storage room door, the world around me seemed to distort. It was as if reality itself was bending, twisting into something grotesque and impossible. The walls felt closer, almost crushing, while the corridor ahead of me stretched bizarrely, as if it would never end. The flashlight trembled in my hand, its weak beam barely able to pierce the darkness that seemed alive, pulsing, swallowing me whole. I moved forward, each step heavier than the last. I was sinking deeper into a nightmare, and every fiber of my being screamed for me to stop, to turn back and run to the safety of the cabin. But I was trapped, not just physically, but mentally, ensnared by a sick curiosity that pushed me toward the abyss. As I moved through the corridors, something began to change. The walls, once cold and metallic, were now covered in a viscous substance, slowly oozing like fresh blood. The metallic stench filled my nostrils, making my stomach churn. I blinked, trying to clear my vision, but everything around me seemed blurred, as if I were looking through broken glass. Then I saw them. At first glance, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, that it was just a reflection or an illusion created by my exhausted mind. But as I got closer, the terrible truth was revealed. The workers who had died in the accident. They were there, but in a way that could only have come from the worst nightmares. Their bodies were twisted, mutilated beyond recognition, trapped in postures of eternal agony. Their mouths were open in silent screams, their eyes fixed on me, begging for something I couldn't give. Some appeared to be in pieces, while others were fused to the walls, as if the factory had absorbed them in its insatiable hunger. I was paralyzed, my mind unable to process the horror unfolding before me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to rid myself of the sight, but my body wouldn't respond. The corridor now seemed endless, each step pulling me deeper into the darkness, closer to madness. The cameras along the hallway began to malfunction, their images distorting, flashing brief glimpses of something I couldn't quite make out. A face? No, it was many faces, all overlapping, all in agony. The images flickered between reality and something straight out of hell, where suffering was the only constant. And then, I felt it. The presence. It was there, with an intensity one couldn't ignore. It was as if the air around me was being drained, leaving only an unbearable cold. I knew I was no longer alone, that something, or someone, was with me in that infernal maze. I could feel its gaze, heavy, fixed on me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. With a final thread of courage, I turned the last corner of the corridor, expecting to find the source of the terror. What I saw took my breath away. A figure stood there, in the center of the hallway, enveloped in a darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It wasn't human, at least not anymore. Its form was almost indistinct, hovering between the world of the living and the dead. I could see traces of the faces of the dead workers mixed into its surface, all silently screaming, all fused into that being that emanated pure hatred. Its eyes, or what was left of them, glimmered for a brief moment, and I felt a sharp pain in my head, as if something was trying to invade my mind, to break through my defenses and settle into my consciousness. I fought the urge to give in, but the pressure was overwhelming. It wanted me to know. It wanted me to understand that there was no escape. I was trapped in a cycle of terror that would never end, a prisoner of the factory that now served as a gateway to something far worse than death. I fell to my knees, the terror crushing me. There was nowhere to run, no way to escape the nightmare. The figure began to move toward me, slow and relentless, and I knew my fate was sealed. The darkness around me seemed to close in tighter, pulling me into its cold, eternal embrace. The last images I saw before losing consciousness were the cameras, now completely corrupted, showing only absolute darkness, with flashes of the distorted faces of the dead, all watching me, all waiting for my arrival. And then, everything went black. The factory, the world, my very existence, all consumed by the darkness, leaving only emptiness and endless terror. I was trapped. Forever.